"Mom, maybe you should find somewhere else to sleep tonight," my son said through the front door of the house I had lived in for 32 years. I stood there with my hand still resting on the doorknob, certain I had heard him wrong. Some sounds simply don't belong together. Words like son and somewhere else, home and locked out, mother and unwanted. For a few seconds I just stared at the door in front of me, waiting for it to open again. Waiting for Ethan to laugh and tell me he was joking. Waiting for him to pull the door wide and say I looked ridiculous standing on the porch with my mouth hanging open. But nothing happened. The door stayed shut. I could still see the warm yellow light coming through the small glass panels beside it. I could still hear faint movement inside. Footsteps. Cabinets opening and closing. The ordinary sounds of life continuing without me. Earlier that afternoon, I had gone to my doctor's appointment across town. Nothing serious. Just routine blood work and a checkup. At 68, appointments seemed to appear on my calendar more often than lunch dates. I had stopped at the grocery store on my way home because Lily loved those little cinnamon cookies shaped like flowers. My granddaughter always smiled when I brought them home. I even bought Ethan his favorite coffee creamer because I noticed we were almost out. It seemed funny now, standing there with grocery bags cutting into my fingers. Funny in the sad kind of way life sometimes becomes when nobody warns you that your world is about to tilt sideways. I pressed the doorbell again. Once. Then twice. I heard movement inside. I heard voices. Then silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence people create on purpose. I looked down at the porch. 2 suitcases sat beside the rocking chair near the window. My suitcases. The blue one with the broken wheel. The small gray carry-on I used when Helen and I drove to Tennessee 3 summers ago. Folded neatly on top was my beige cardigan. The one I always kept hanging near the kitchen because the air conditioning made me cold. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I looked back at the door. My heartbeat wasn't racing. I wasn't crying. Wasn't even angry. Not yet. I just felt strangely empty. Like someone had quietly reached inside me and removed something important while I wasn't looking. I sat down slowly in the rocking chair and placed the grocery bags at my feet. Across the street, Mrs. Reynolds was walking her golden retriever. A car drove past with music playing. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly like every other Thursday evening in our neighborhood. Except I wasn't inside my own home anymore. I stared at the front window beside the door. The curtains moved slightly. Just for a second. Someone had looked outside. I knew who it was before the curtain even stopped moving. Vanessa. I said nothing. I didn't wave. I didn't stand up. I just sat there watching the house my late husband and I had bought all those years ago. Watching the porch light above me flicker as the automatic timer switched on for the evening. And for the first time since Richard passed away 2 years earlier, I suddenly had one terrible thought I couldn't push away. This house had started changing long before I ever noticed it. And somehow, I had been the last person to realize it. I stayed on the porch for another 20 minutes before I finally stood up. I do not know what I had been waiting for exactly. Maybe for Ethan to come outside and tell me this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe for Lily to run to the door asking where Grandma had gone. Maybe for common sense to suddenly return to that house. But none of those things happened. The porch light glowed above me while the evening sky slowly darkened. I picked up my suitcases and grocery bags and walked down the driveway. The wheel on my blue suitcase made that familiar clicking sound against the concrete. Click, click, click. Richard used to complain about that wheel for years. "Margaret, one day I am buying you a new suitcase," he would say with a smile. I used to laugh and tell him I liked the sound because it reminded me of all the places we had gone together. Funny how certain sounds become memories after someone is gone. I reached my car and set the bags in the back seat. Then I sat there, with my hands resting on the steering wheel. I stared through the windshield without starting the engine. Home. Such a small word. For letters. But people spend their whole lives building one. Richard and I bought that house when Ethan was 9 years old. Back then we barely had enough money for the down payment. I still remembered sleeping on a mattress on the floor for nearly 6 weeks because we could not afford bedroom furniture after closing costs. I remembered painting walls ourselves on weekends and eating takeout pizza sitting on upside-down boxes. I remembered Ethan running through empty rooms shouting because he loved hearing his voice echo. We built every corner of that place with years of ordinary moments. Christmas mornings. Birthday cakes. School pictures taped to the refrigerator. Family dinners around the oak table Richard insisted on buying even though I thought it was too expensive. 32 years of ordinary life. And now I had just been left outside like a package nobody wanted to bring in. I started the engine and drove slowly out of the neighborhood. I did not have a destination in mind. I only knew I could not sit outside that house all night. I drove through familiar streets while streetlights flickered on one by one. Past the grocery store where Richard used to buy flowers every Friday. Past the church where Ethan graduated high school. Past the diner where Helen and I had breakfast every other Tuesday for nearly 10 years. Everything looked the same. The world had not changed at all. Only mine had. Then something small slipped into my mind. So small I almost ignored it. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked into the kitchen one morning and noticed my family picture was gone from the wall. It was the framed photo we took at Lily's 8th birthday party. Richard had been standing beside me with his arm around my shoulder. Ethan stood on my left. Lily sat in front smiling with missing front teeth. Vanessa had said she moved it because she wanted to redecorate the living room. At the time I had smiled and told her the new arrangement looked nice. 2 weeks earlier, I noticed my favorite reading chair had disappeared from the den. Vanessa said she had donated it because the fabric looked worn. Last week I opened the hall closet and found 3 winter coats missing. She said she thought I no longer used them. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. One memory became another. Then another. Then another. Suddenly it felt like standing in front of a giant puzzle, while someone quietly handed me the missing pieces. And for the first time that night I stopped wondering why I was outside the house. I started wondering how long they had been preparing for me to leave. I did not realize where I was driving until I saw the familiar red sign outside Miller's Diner. The parking lot sat half full beneath the evening lights, and for a second I simply stared at it through my windshield. Richard used to bring me there every Friday after Ethan moved away for college. We called it our retirement practice. He would laugh every time he said it because neither of us had enough money to think seriously about retirement back then. We would sit in the same booth near the window, split a slice of apple pie, and pretend we had all the time in the world. I parked and walked inside slowly. The little bell above the door rang as I entered. Warm air and the smell of coffee wrapped around me immediately. The waitress behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Margaret, your usual booth is open." I smiled back automatically. Funny how some places remember you even when people do not. I slid into the booth and wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee after she brought it over. I had not realized how cold I felt until then. Not outside cold. Not weather cold. Something different. I sat there staring at steam rising from the cup while pieces of the past kept drifting through my mind. Ethan had not always been distant. That was the part my heart struggled with most. My little boy used to wait by the front window every evening for Richard to come home from work. He used to climb into my bed after thunderstorms because he hated lightning. When he was 10 years old, he got the flu and slept beside me on the couch because he said he felt safer hearing me breathe nearby. I remembered one winter when he was 12. Money had been tight that year. Richard's hours had been cut at the factory, and we barely kept up with bills. Ethan wanted a new bicycle for Christmas. Not an expensive one. Just a red mountain bike he saw at a sporting goods store. Richard and I spent weeks pretending we could not afford it. On Christmas morning, Ethan walked downstairs expecting nothing and nearly cried when he saw it beside the tree. Years later, I found out Richard had sold his fishing boat to buy it. Ethan hugged him and said, "When I grow up, I am taking care of both of you forever." I used to replay that memory whenever life felt difficult. I believed promises made by children because children usually mean them when they say them. Somewhere along the way things changed. I just never noticed exactly when. Maybe it happened slowly, like water dripping onto stone. One drop at a time until eventually something looked different and you could not remember when it started. Vanessa entered Ethan's life 12 years ago. First I liked her. She was polished and organized and always smiled. She brought flowers when she visited. She remembered birthdays. She called me mom after only 6 months. I thought Ethan had found someone kind. But then little things started happening after they got married. Family dinners moved from every Sunday to once a month. Then birthdays became shorter. Holidays became complicated. There was always some reason. Some scheduling problem. Some conflict. Ethan always looked uncomfortable explaining it. I used to tell myself I was imagining things. I used to tell myself families changed and children grew up. I lifted the coffee cup and took a slow sip. Then another memory slid quietly into place. 3 months ago I had walked into the kitchen and heard Vanessa stop talking the second I entered. Ethan looked down at his plate. Vanessa smiled and said, "We were just discussing house stuff." House stuff. At the time I thought nothing of it. Sitting there now, I suddenly realized something that made me set my cup down very slowly. I could not remember the last time anyone in that house had asked me what I wanted. I sat in that booth long after the coffee stopped steaming. Outside the diner windows, the sky had turned completely dark and reflections from passing headlights slid across the glass like slow-moving shadows. I looked down at my phone sitting beside the sugar packets. Ethan had not called. There was no text message. No missed call. Nothing. I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it again. Strange how silence can sometimes feel louder than words. The waitress walked by and gently refilled my cup without asking. I thanked her and forced a small smile. She probably thought I was just another tired woman sitting alone after a long day. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was not. I looked out the window again and suddenly remembered something Richard used to say whenever I worried too much about things. He would sit in his recliner with his reading glasses sliding halfway down his nose and say, "Margaret, when something feels wrong, it usually started being wrong long before you noticed it." Back then I used to laugh at him because he always acted like he understood life better than everyone else. Most of the time he was right, which only annoyed me more. I could almost hear his voice now. The thought settled heavily in my chest. Because if Richard had been here tonight, he would have noticed changes much sooner than I did. He would have seen Ethan looking away during conversations. He would have noticed Vanessa rearranging pieces of our home little by little. He would have asked questions I never thought to ask. Richard paid attention to things. I always paid attention to people. Maybe that was my mistake. I believed love meant trust. I believed family meant permanence. I reached into my purse for my wallet and accidentally brushed against something folded at the bottom. I pulled it out slowly. It was an old grocery receipt from 2 weeks earlier. Across the back of it, in my own handwriting, I had written a reminder. Pick up Richard's anniversary flowers Friday. I stared at the words and felt my throat tighten. Then I remembered. 2 weeks ago had been our wedding anniversary. 38 years. I had gone to the cemetery that morning with fresh flowers. When I came back home that afternoon, Ethan and Vanessa were sitting at the kitchen table looking through papers. Vanessa had quickly stacked them together when I walked in. Ethan stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. I remembered smiling and apologizing for interrupting them. Interrupting them. In my own kitchen. I closed my eyes slowly. One memory after another kept appearing now, lining themselves up neatly as if they had been waiting for me to finally see them. Then my phone suddenly lit up beside my coffee cup. For a moment my heart jumped because I thought it might be Ethan. But it was not. The screen showed Helen Carter. I stared at her name for a second before answering. "Margaret," she said immediately, and something in her voice sounded strange. "Honey, where are you right now?" For a moment I just sat there staring at the phone pressed against my ear. Helen rarely sounded nervous. In the 10 years I had known her, I had seen her calm down crying children, deal with broken pipes during winter storms, and handle every neighborhood problem with the same steady voice. But tonight something felt different. "I am at Miller's," I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. Then I heard her let out a breath. "Stay there," she said. "Do not go back to the house yet." I frowned slightly. "Helen, what is going on?" Another pause. "I will be there in 10 minutes. Then she hung up. I looked down at my phone for a second before setting it beside my coffee cup. My stomach suddenly felt strange. Not pain exactly. More like the feeling you get standing at the top of a staircase when you miss a step you thought was there. 10 minutes later I saw Helen's car pull into the parking lot. She walked inside wearing a light blue sweater and white sneakers, carrying her purse tightly under one arm. She spotted me immediately. Usually Helen smiled the second she saw me. Tonight she did not. She slid into the booth across from me and looked directly at my face for several seconds without saying anything. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Margaret, she said softly, why are your suitcases in your car?
Ich blinkte her.
How did you know that? Her eyes moved away for a moment. Then she looked back at me. Because I saw Ethan carrying them outside this afternoon.
Ich starrte her.
I did not say anything. I could not. It felt like every sound inside the diner suddenly moved farther away. Forks clinking against plates. Coffee pouring somewhere behind us. Quiet conversations. Everything felt distant. I thought maybe you were taking a trip, Helen continued carefully. But then I saw Vanessa outside talking to someone I did not recognize. I felt my fingers tighten around my coffee cup. Someone. Helen nodded slowly. A man in a gray suit. They were standing near the driveway. She hesitated. Margaret, I was not trying to listen, but I was watering flowers near my front porch and I heard part of the conversation. I swallowed slowly. What conversation? Helen looked uncomfortable. She looked down at the table before speaking. Vanessa said something about timing. My heartbeat felt strangely heavy inside my chest. Helen continued quietly. Then she said, once everything is finalized, we can move forward. I stared at her face. My thoughts moved slowly now like they were pushing through deep water. Move forward with what? I asked. Helen shook her head. I do not know. Then she leaned closer. But that is not what worried me. I felt cold all over again. Margaret, she said very softly, there was a real estate sign sitting in the back of that man's car. For several seconds I just looked at Helen without saying anything. A real estate sign. The words sat in my mind without fully settling. It felt impossible in the same way hearing your own doctor say something unexpected feels impossible. Your ears hear the words, but the rest of you refuses to catch up. I stared down at my coffee cup and watched my reflection tremble in the dark surface. Richard and I bought that house when Ethan still had baseball cards taped to his bedroom walls. We planted maple trees in the backyard ourselves. We built the deck one summer after saving money for nearly 2 years. Richard spent every Saturday sanding wood while Ethan followed him around carrying tools that were too heavy for him. That house was never just property. It was every version of our lives sitting under one roof. Helen squeezed my hand gently. Margaret, she said quietly. I blinked and looked back at her. I do not understand, I whispered. The house is still in my name and Richard's trust. Helen frowned slightly. Trust. I nodded slowly. Richard had always handled financial matters. Not because I could not do it, but because numbers and paperwork somehow fascinated him. He used to joke that retirement gave him 2 hobbies: weather forecasts and organizing files. After he passed away 2 years earlier, I remembered Daniel Brooks helping me sort through paperwork and legal documents. I had signed forms and read explanations and nodded through meetings while grief sat over me like heavy fog. I remembered Daniel saying something about protecting assets and simplifying future issues. At the time I barely understood half of what he explained. I was too busy trying to survive losing Richard. I suddenly sat up straighter in the booth. Helen looked at me carefully. What is it? She asked. I stared at the table for a moment. Daniel. I had not spoken to him in months. Maybe longer. But Daniel Brooks had handled Richard's estate planning for years. He knew every detail of our finances, every account, every document, every signature. Richard trusted him completely. I reached for my purse and found my phone again. My fingers hesitated over the screen. Then I stopped. Something inside me suddenly felt different. Not better. Not stronger exactly. Just quieter. Earlier that evening I felt hurt, confused, lost. But now something else had started appearing beneath all of that. Questions. I looked up at Helen. Do you know something strange? I said softly. She tilted her head. I looked out through the diner windows toward the dark parking lot. Ethan never asked me to leave. Helen stared at me. I continued slowly. He said maybe I should stay somewhere else tonight. I looked back at her. That is different. Helen said nothing. He did not tell me why, I said quietly. He did not explain anything. I felt my fingers tighten around my phone. And people who know they are right usually explain themselves. The silence between us stretched for a few seconds. Then I unlocked my phone and searched through my contacts until I found Daniel Brooks. I stared at his name before pressing call. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Margaret, Daniel said, sounding surprised. This is unusual. Is everything all right? I looked down at the table and spoke very calmly. Daniel, I said, I think I need to ask you something about my house. Daniel was quiet for a few seconds after I finished explaining everything. I told him about coming home from my appointment. I told him about the suitcases on the porch and Ethan asking me to stay somewhere else. I told him what Helen had seen earlier that afternoon. He did not interrupt me once. The only sound I heard was his breathing on the other end of the line, and the faint noise of papers moving somewhere in the background. Finally he spoke. Margaret, he said carefully, where are you right now? At Miller's Diner. Another pause. Good. I frowned slightly. Good. He let out a slow breath. Listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. And do not let anyone pressure you into making decisions tonight. Helen and I looked at each other across the table. Something in Daniel's voice had changed. I had known him for almost 20 years. He always spoke calmly, even after Richard passed away. While helping me through endless paperwork and meetings, his voice never changed. Tonight I heard something else beneath his words. Concern. Real concern. I sat back slowly against the booth seat. Daniel, I said quietly, what exactly is happening? I heard more papers moving. Then he spoke again. Margaret, I am looking at your file right now. He paused. And there is something important you need to understand. My hand tightened around the phone. Your house was placed into a protected family trust 7 years ago. I blinked. I know that. No, he said gently. I do not think you fully do. I stared at the table. 7 years ago Richard had spent months talking about future planning. I remembered him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by folders and yellow notepads. He kept saying he wanted everything organized so I would never have to worry about anything if something happened to him. Back then I joked that he was acting like an 85-year-old man preparing for the end of civilization. He just smiled and kept writing notes. Margaret, Daniel continued, the house cannot simply be sold because someone wants to sell it. My heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. What do you mean? I asked quietly. Daniel answered immediately. The trust has conditions. Helen was watching my face now. I could feel her eyes on me. Conditions. I repeated. Richard specifically included occupancy protections. My forehead tightened in confusion. I do not understand. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. As long as you are alive, Margaret, no one can force you out of that house. No one can sell it without your authorization. No one. I stopped breathing for a second. Around me I could still hear dishes clinking and people talking softly throughout the diner. But suddenly it felt like all those sounds had moved somewhere far away. I stared out the window into the parking lot darkness. Ethan knew Richard planned everything carefully. Vanessa knew too. Suddenly another thought entered my mind. Sharp and cold. If they knew they could not legally force me out, then why were they acting like they already had? Daniel spoke again. Margaret. I blinked slowly. Yes. He hesitated for just a second. There is something else. I felt my stomach sink. Earlier this week, he said carefully, someone called my office asking questions about transferring ownership rights. The words settled over me slowly. Someone called his office. Someone had already been asking questions. I sat there holding the phone against my ear while a strange feeling moved through me. Earlier that night I had felt shock, then confusion, then hurt. But now I felt something different. I felt clarity, cold and quiet clarity. Who called? I asked. Daniel hesitated. I cannot give details about private conversations, he said carefully. But I can tell you this. Whoever called seemed to believe ownership could be transferred quickly if certain documents were signed. I stared out through the diner window, the parking lot. Lights reflected against the glass, turning everything outside into blurry shapes. Certain documents. I suddenly remembered Vanessa appearing in my bedroom doorway 2 months earlier with a stack of papers in her hand. She had smiled and said, Margaret, These are just some routine forms for insurance updates and household records. Ethan is signing them too. I remembered looking at the pages and feeling overwhelmed by the small print. I had told her I would read them later. Then Richard's voice had appeared in my head, the same thing he used to say every single time paperwork arrived in the mail. Never sign something on a tired day, Maggie. I had laughed at him for being overly cautious, but I never signed those papers. Vanessa asked about them twice afterward. Then she stopped asking. I closed my eyes slowly. Helen was still watching me across the table. Margaret, she said gently. I looked at her. I think they expected me to sign something. Saying the words out loud felt strange. Not because I doubted them anymore. Because suddenly I did not. The pieces fit together too well now. The missing pictures. The furniture disappearing. The quiet conversations stopping when I entered rooms. The real estate sign. The suitcases already packed. They had been moving pieces around me for months, while I kept believing I was standing in the center of my own life. Daniel's voice returned through the phone. Margaret, listen carefully. Go somewhere safe tonight. Tomorrow morning I want you in my office. I nodded even though he could not see me. All right. And Margaret, he said, do not tell anyone we spoke. I frowned slightly. Why? There was a pause. Because if someone believes they already won, they usually stop being careful. After we ended the call, I sat very still. Helen waited quietly. Then she finally asked, what are you going to do? I looked down at the untouched coffee sitting in front of me. Earlier tonight I would have cried. Earlier tonight I would have driven back and begged Ethan to explain. Earlier tonight I would have stood outside that house wondering what I did wrong. But earlier tonight felt like it belonged to someone else now. I looked up at Helen and gave her a small smile. Nothing, I said softly. I am going to do absolutely nothing at all. Helen insisted I stay at her house that night, but I barely slept. I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling while shadows from tree branches moved slowly across the walls. Every few hours I checked my phone. Still nothing from Ethan. No call. No message. No explanation. Around 6:30 the next morning, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and sat near Helen's kitchen window with a cup of coffee in both hands. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to wake up. Sprinklers clicked across green lawns. Newspaper delivery trucks rolled down the street. A man jogged past wearing bright orange running shoes. Everything looked ordinary. The world always amazes me that way. Even when your own life feels like it is splitting apart, morning still arrives on time. At 9 o'clock I walked into Daniel Brooks' office carrying my purse and the same blue suitcase with the broken wheel. Daniel greeted me at the door himself. He looked serious but not surprised. As if he had already spent the morning preparing for something. He led me into his office and closed the door quietly behind us. Then he placed a thick folder on his desk. My name sat neatly printed across the front. Margaret Dawson. He sat down and folded his hands. Before we discuss anything else, he said, I need to show you something. He opened the folder and turned several pages toward me. I looked down at the documents without understanding them at first. Legal language, signatures, property records. Then Daniel pointed to a date near the bottom of one page. 2 weeks earlier. Yesterday afternoon, he said carefully. Someone submitted preliminary requests involving ownership questions and potential sale procedures. I looked up slowly. Yesterday. Daniel nodded. Yes. My stomach tightened slightly. Yesterday afternoon. While I had been sitting in a doctor's office discussing blood pressure numbers and vitamins, someone had apparently been planning the future of my home. Daniel looked at me for several seconds before speaking again. Margaret, there is something Richard included in the trust. Documents that nobody asked about. I frowned. What do you mean? Daniel pulled another sheet from the folder and placed it in front of me. Richard added a final provision years ago. I looked down at the page. Then I read the words once. Then twice. Suddenly I understood why Daniel had gone quiet. Richard had written that if any direct family member attempted to remove me from my residence through manipulation, pressure, or deception, that person would immediately lose any future property rights connected to the trust. I stared at the paper while my eyes slowly moved across every word. Richard. Even after 2 years, somehow he had still been protecting me. Daniel sat quietly across from me while I read. Finally, I looked up. Outside his office window, people walked along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life moving forward as usual. I smiled very softly and folded the paper closed. Then I looked at Daniel and said, I think Ethan and Vanessa believe they locked the wrong person out.